Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Diplomatic Enclave. I am your host, Omer Khalid. Now, history is very important for any country, whether it be Pakistan, whether it be any other nation in the world. History brings two nations together or pulls them apart. What is the significance of history as far as Pakistan is concerned? We know Pakistan became independent in 1947. It was a British colony before that. But not many people know that many soldiers from Pakistan went and participated in the First and the Second World Wars when there was a joint subcontinent. These people mostly were from the Punjab region, but also from other regions of what is now Pakistan. It's very important to trace those roots of people who have been so helpful as far as striking down important points of world history are concerned, such as the world wars. Some people are working in that respect and in some way are bridging those countries and Pakistan together. In this special episode of Diplomatic Enclave, we are going to talk to one such person. He is a historian, a researcher, who's here in Pakistan from the United Kingdom, trying to trace some of the families of those soldiers who participated in the Second World War from the side that is now considered to be Pakistan. His name is Ghee Bowman, and without further ado, let me introduce to him. Ghee Bowman, thank you very much to have given us the time. And it was, I would say, not an easy task to trace you. Ghee, let's begin from the very beginning, as we say. Why become interested in history?
I've always been interested in history, Omar. I think there's something about history that brings us to the past and brings the past to the present. I think everything that we do is related to history. You know, everything that we have around us in one day will be gone, and everything that was there before that used to be around people, that was something that was live and was new and was exciting for them. So we all live in history. Everything that about us is in history. And when we talk in present tense or future tense or past tense. So we are always in history.
All right. You did your PhD from Exeter not very long ago, in 2016, in fact. What were your theses as far as your PhD was concerned?
Well, I'm actually working on the PhD now.
All right.
I'm still a student.
Finished.
I'm still a student. I'm a very immature student.
All right, and what are you working on? Are you working on this aspect of history?
Yes, I'm working on a particular group of soldiers who were called Force K6. Force K6 was a name for this group of men, about 4,000 men. And they went from here, they went from Punjab, and they were Muslims, and they went from here to Europe, to Vilayet, in 1939, at the beginning of the Second World War. And what I'm trying to do is to trace where they went and what they did and who they met and all the things that happened to them during that period. And I found some very interesting stories.
But when you wanted to begin researching on a topic that is not as relevant as I might say, their families might be dispersed all around Pakistan, might not be in Pakistan but in any other country. Yeah. Why delve into a topic that is not an easy task?
Indeed. Well, that's right. It's not an easy task, and it's a bit like a detective work, you know. Almost, I have to kind of put things together. I have to take a piece of evidence from here, and an interview that I've had, and a photo from there, and bring them together and kind of think, what is the significance of these things going together? But the fact that it's hard actually makes it more interesting.
All right. When you speak of researching on those families that went in 1939, those soldiers from the Punjab region of Pakistan that went in 1939 to Europe, in fact, to participate in the Second World War. What, in your point of view, has been their inclination to participate in the Second World War? Because you've done a lot of research on that. Mm-hmm.
Well, the ones who went, they were all professional soldiers. Some of them even had been in the First World War. So some of these chaps were, you know, in their 40s already. They'd been for years in the army. Maybe their fathers had been in the army, or even their grandfathers as well. So for them, it was a profession. And they were, I'm hoping to confirm this, but my understanding is that the men from this area of Punjab, they went and they joined the army because it was an opportunity for advancement. It was an opportunity for them to to travel, yes, but more importantly to get some money to bring that home, to get some, to be able to improve the situation for their family. And in a place where it wasn't very fertile, they were coming. A lot of them were coming from villages, coming from fairly poor family backgrounds. So one son in the family, or maybe several sons in the family, would go and join the British Indian Army, and then they would bring back some money, and then they would help to improve the family. So they weren't, I don't think, they weren't kind of signing up, for the king. It wasn't about that, I don't think. And it wasn't for their country either, because, in a way you could say that they were fighting against their country, because the British were here as the imperial power, and these guys were supporting them. They were working for the imperial power. So they weren't working for their country, really, because their country, of course, didn't
exist at that time.
It didn't appear until 1947, exactly. Yeah. So they were doing it out of financial reasons, I think.
All right. So Ghee, some of those soldiers were from Punjab. Some were from the area that is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. They were Pathans. There's a lot of pride as well as finances involved when soldiers, whether it be from Pakistan or any other country, go to fight, because they want to show that they are capable of delivering results. Do you feel that these soldiers that went from the Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa regions at this moment from Pakistan did deliver in the Second World War?
Oh, they certainly did deliver, absolutely, yeah. And these guys were successful in what they were doing. And I think that idea of pride is interesting, and then there's the idea of honor as well, this is something that a man does, a man works in the field, but yes, a man also goes and works in the army, and that's something to be, you're strong, and that's something to be proud of. I think that's part of it, yeah.
Was any member of your family, Ghee, also involved in it, somehow directly or indirectly, as far as this K6 force is concerned?
No, not at all. I mean, my father was in the Royal Air Force in the Second World War. He was in Egypt. My grandfathers were both in the First World War, but no, there's no family connection here.
All right, because sometimes someone is prompted or attracted towards a certain topic because there's a personal interest in it. Yours was a purely professional interest.
Well, sort of. I mean, what happened was I was working on a project. I live in the city called Exeter, which is a small city in the southwest of England. I was working on a project about the multicultural history of Exeter. Now, Exeter is a city that people in Britain, they usually think that this is a white city. It always has been, it always will be. And actually what this project did was it found lots of interesting stories about the diversity of people who'd come there and lived there for thousands of years, from the Romans onwards. And while I was doing this research, I was looking at a book about Devon during the Second World War. And in there were these 3 photographs. And these 3 photographs showed these men with pagris, with mules and horses, and they were in my part of the country. They were near Exeter. And I was really surprised by that. And I thought, wow, I never knew that this happened in the Second World War. I need to know more about this. So I went to the National Archives in London, and I found some documents. I found some diaries of one of the units. And it was just such a fascinating story that it actually really moved me, the story. It was so interesting. And I wanted to find out more. So I did my master's on this, and now I'm doing my PhD.
Great. Tell us a brief overview of what that K6 force was all about. There's a couple of thousands of men that went from the region that is now part of Pakistan. What did they do over there? What did they achieve during the Second World War?
So they left this part of the country on the 10th of December 1939. They went down to Bombay. They got on boats. They sailed across the Indian Ocean, through the canal, the Suez Canal, through the Mediterranean to Marseille in the south of France, where they arrived on December the 26th, 1939. And you can see that in film footage. There's some film footage from that time which shows them getting off the boats with their mules. That's very important. The mules were essential here, because at that time, in 1939, the British Army had no mules. The British Army had got rid of all the mules. And here in this part of the world, there were 30 companies of mule transport companies. So, and each company had 300 men and about the same number of mules. So they were an essential component of working with the British Army. They brought skills, they brought know-how, they brought experience, they brought equipment and mules that we didn't have in the British Army at that time. So that's a really interesting idea. I think that they were doing something that the British couldn't do then. So they went to Marseille, they landed in Marseille, they went up into the north of France, and again you can see some footage of them in this wonderful film which was shown here in South Asia. And they went, and then of course they were there for a few months, very bad winter, one of the coldest winters of the 20th century. May the 10th, 1940, the Germans attacked. Big, blitzkrieg, lots of panic, the British and the French weren't really able to resist them. And so the British Army and the French Army and these companies went towards the English Channel to try and escape. And they got to the city which is called Dunkirk. And Dunkirk is this small town on the coast. It's 23 miles, I think, across to England. You can see England from there. And there, the British Navy started to take these soldiers off the beach and take them to Britain. And that was 338,000 British and French soldiers were taken off that beach and taken back to Britain. And amongst those 338,000, there were 650 from the Punjab, 650 from here. The rest of Force K6 went out by other ways, but one company was taken prisoner. So one company went into a German prisoner of war camp, and there's lots more stories about them. Most of them went to Britain, and then they stayed there. Now, at first, they weren't sure what should we do with these guys, because they had the mules, right? But they had to leave the mules in France. So all the mules were stuck in France. All the mules were taken by the German army or taken by the local farmers. So they didn't have any mules to begin with. So they got some more mules. And then they thought, what are we going to do with these soldiers? And then Churchill had a plan. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, he had a rather crazy plan, which no one else agreed with, which was to attack Norway. Norway, a country in the far northwest of Europe, which was occupied by the Germans. And he thought, okay, we can attack there, but if we're going to attack there, we need mountain troops. This is not the territory for ordinary soldiers, not a territory for tanks.
And this is where the people from Punjab come in.
Exactly, because they had the training, they had the mules. So they spent the next 3.5 years working with British regiments, training them in how to work with mules. And then 3 more companies came from here to join them. So now the numbers got bigger. And they spent those next 3.5 years in the UK training, going to different parts of the country. And when they were going around in the UK, the places they were going to were generally rural areas. These were country areas. They weren't in the cities very much. They were in the southwest, they were in Wales, and they were in the north of Scotland. Because these are the places where they would be training, where they'd be working. So they stayed in Britain until 1944, the beginning of 1944. So that was a period when the war in South Asia was very strong, when the Japanese were attacking through Burma and up to Impal and that northeast corner. And so they were sent, Force K6 were sent back, January 1944, sent back, landed in Bombay, went to Delhi, and there was a big speech of welcome. General Auchinleck gave them a great big speech of welcome, and they came back up here to Punjab. And then I'm not sure what happened to them after that. It's not entirely clear what happened.
And that is why you're kind of back here to trace that era between 1944 and the current era of what happened to these people.
Exactly.
Right. Ghee, before we go forward, let's go a bit backwards while you were giving your detailed answer on these Punjabis' participation in the Second World War. You talked about Dunkirk. Now, there is not much participation cinematically, if I might say, in Christopher Nolan's latest film that has also been nominated for a lot of Oscars, that is also named Dunkirk. He does not mention these South Asian soldiers, these soldiers from Punjab. Why is that?
That's a very good question. It's a very good film. I mean, it really is a good film, and I think it will probably get some awards. And, it's strange that he chose not to focus on the guys from Punjab in that film. But it's also strange, his focus is quite limited. It's the Air Force, and it's this one boat, and it's these few soldiers. And actually, it's also interesting that he doesn't really give much focus to the French soldiers. As I said, about 1/3 of the soldiers who were taken off that beach were French. And he hardly gives you anything at all about the French. So I think, and it's not surprising that the people in France are angry about that as well. I think he missed an opportunity with Force K6. I think he could have made some really interesting scenes about them. You know, because one of their officers was a South Asian guy here from Punjab, Major Akbar Khan. After the war, he was a general. He was on the beach at Dunkirk. He marched along the beach with 300 men of the 25th Company on May the 29th, 1940. He marched along that beach, and I can just picture those guys with their pugdies, you know, amongst all the chaos and the German Air Force. You know, you see in that film that the Luftwaffe coming in and bombing, and the shells coming in and things burning. It's a terrible scene. And there are these 300 guys from the Punjab marching along in good order, marching to the place where the boat was. And I think he missed an opportunity, to be honest. But
I hope that will be represented somehow, somewhere, in some future kind of production.
And I think actually what is needed is a whole film about
on the K6 Force.
Not just a bit of film, but the whole film.
It's interesting that you mentioned Major General Muhammad Akbar Khan, because I recently read an article that came in the Herald way back in 2016, written by his great grandson, in fact, whose name is Sayyid Hashmi. He talks about all this ordeal of his great-great-grandfather, about how he served in Dunkirk, how he withheld the opposition, and how he survived, and how he conquered eventually. So that is an interesting story, and it kind of brings to perspective the work that you're doing, because you're bringing together that work that the Pakistani side is doing through Sayyid Hashmi also, and your side. So it's kind of bridging both countries, United Kingdom and Pakistan, together again as well. How do you feel, Ghee, being that historical ambassador?
Historical ambassador.
I would kind of put you in that.
I like that. No, I like that. I think that's an interesting idea, because I do feel that when I go to another country, that I want to tell stories, and I want to hear stories, and I want to give and I want to take. So when I meet people who are people in the UK and now people here in Pakistan who have these memories, for me it's always an exchange. You know, I always have an idea that I want to hear what they remember, and maybe they have some photos or some letters or something like that from then, or even they have something like a medal, something from 75 years ago. But also I have these things that I want to tell them, and I think in a way that's a bit like an ambassador, yeah. So it is about bridging between cultures.
Exactly.
That's for sure.
I think that, as I said in the very beginning of my show, history bridges, maybe tears apart nations as well, but also bridges countries, because there's a joint history, as has been in the case with the United Kingdom and Pakistan, with the colony beforehand, and also with these Punjabis and the Pathans that went and served in the Second World War. Now, did you come into contact with Sayyid Hashmi, who wrote this article on his great-great-grandfather?
I haven't met him yet, but I hope to. I mean, he lives in the United States, and I've talked to him and I've emailed him, and I think we've become good friends actually through the internet. But he's sent me some very interesting stuff, and I've sent him some stuff, and so the photos that appeared in that article are ones that I sent him. So yeah, no, I haven't met him yet, but I've met another relative of General Akbar, and I hope to meet some more, inshallah. Yeah.
All right. Ghee, when you began your research on these troops that participated in the Second World War, where did your research begin from as far as their families is concerned? Are there any families or remnants of those soldiers in England at this moment?
There are, yes, there are. There's two that I've met, and probably others. So there's, for example, one of the soldiers was a man called Chowdhury Wali Muhammad, okay, and he was in the 32nd Company. So he was at Dunkirk. He was there. He went to France. He was at the Battle of Dunkirk, and he came back. He came to Britain, and he tells a little story. There's a little story he wrote about after he'd been in England for about a week. He went with the company to a mosque, and he said how wonderful it was to see this mosque here, you know, on the other side of the world, 7,000 miles away. Here's this beautiful mosque, and they were so happy to worship there. This mosque is the Shah Jahan Mosque in Woking, which is just very close to London. Oh, right. It's the oldest mosque in Britain. And he then went on, and he did, you know, various other things, and then eventually he came back here, and now his son lives in Woking.
All right.
So his son has a taxi company, a very successful taxi company in that same town of Woking. And I met him a couple of years ago, and we talked at great length, and he showed me photos, and he talked to me about what his father had, how proud his father had been about being part of this, and how his father had come to Britain, and they'd gone on a tour around the country looking for all the places that he remembered from when he was there as a young man. And it's lovely to hear these stories and to see the photos of this soldier.
Was he the only person that you came into contact with in England?
The other story is a very interesting story, quite a long story, that I will tell you about a man called Jeff. Now, Jeff was born in 1942 in a small town in Cornwall in the southwest of England, a town called St Austell. And Jeff grew up there, and he thought his mother and his father were both these white people from that place there. And he was quite good at school. He went to university. He worked as a teacher, and so on. And many years later, when he was 40, and his skin was quite dark, and he just thought his skin was dark. His mum said to him, "Oh, we have some Portuguese ancestry. Some of our ancestors came from Portugal. That's why you have dark skin, Jeff." And he said, "Oh, okay." And he also had a younger brother who was the same as him. An older brother and older sister who had very white skin. Him and his brother Ron, quite dark skin. So he went on for many years until when he was in his 40s, he was talking to his sister, and his sister said, "Yeah, don't you? When back in the 1940s, there was this group of Asian soldiers who were stationed near our house, and one of them," she said, "one of these soldiers used to come to our house and visit the house and became friends with our mum because their dad, or the person they thought was their father, was away. He was working in Plymouth." So this man used to come to our house, and he made friends with our mum, and he used to stay sometimes downstairs in the front room, and his name was Jamal Khan. And Jeff was just really surprised and shocked about this. And then he started to think, and over the years he thought some more, and eventually, but his mother never said anything about it. His mother died about 20 years ago without ever telling him anything about who his father was. And eventually, after his mother had died, he was talking to an aunt, and the aunt said, "Oh yes, of course." She said, "I was there when you were born. I know that your father was one of these soldiers from Punjab. I know that he was Jamal Khan." And didn't you know? And he was astounded. And he's done some research as well, and I've done some research for him, and I haven't found Jamal Khan, but there is one person I've got a list of the names of the men of K6. I've got 2,000 names, and amongst those, there's only one Jamal. There's lots of Mohammeds and Imtiaz and Alis and so on, but there's one Jamal Khan, and I wonder if it's the same one. And I would really be interested to find somewhere if there's
that would be interesting to find out what their side of the story is and what he's kind of found out over the years and over the decades about what his father Jamal Khan was and how he came to that area and from which regiment was he belonging to and all the stories that were related to it. You were talking of the mosques that they found in Woking, but apart from Woking, there were also some mosques that that platoon went to when it returned to the United Kingdom. That was in Cardiff and in East London. Any stories from that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a small Muslim community in Britain at that time. I don't know how many thousand, but not very big. And so the first mosque was this one in Woking, and then in 1941 one opened in London, in East London, not the big mosque, but a small one. And so they were invited to go there. And there's some lovely photos of them at the mosque. There's a photo of one man doing wudu, and there's another photo of a feast. It must have been Eid time, I think. And they were there as guests of honor, really, because they were a kind of respected part of the small Muslim community in the country, and some of the other Muslims who were there were helping them. So some very famous Muslims were there as well. And in Cardiff, the same thing happened. A mosque, because Cardiff is a place in South Wales, the capital of Wales. It's had a Muslim community for a while. Some men from Yemen, particularly. And they opened a new mosque there again in 1941, and some of the men from Force K6 went there and were part of that celebration. So they were kind of seen as being like partly sort of ambassadors and representatives of Islam in the UK.
And how were they assimilated at that time when they came to the United Kingdom? Because you see, nowadays we see a lot of, pardon my expression, racism when it comes to different parts of the world.
That's
we've,
fine.
We've got Brexit in the United Kingdom as well.
Yeah.
That has changed the perspective on how the different races and different cultures are assimilated in the United Kingdom. How do you feel during your research of those Pakistanis, people belonging to the different areas of Pakistan who went and to the United Kingdom, were assimilated amongst the British people? How was the reaction from the British people? You must have done your research in that respect as well.
That's a very interesting question, and it's one of the main questions I think that I'm interested in. And let's not be frightened of talking about racism, because racism exists, and it exists in Britain for sure now, and it existed then in the 1940s, but it was different. It was different, so in those days there was no equality legislation. There was nothing that said that we have to treat people the same. So people just automatically thought we will treat them differently. Now, I've looked at lots of documents, lots of newspaper reports, and some testimony, some stories from these soldiers themselves. Actually, I haven't seen many examples of racism. There's one example from Wales when they were in a swimming pool and somebody said, I don't want to swim in the same pool as these guys. And there's a couple of other very vague stories. But mostly the stories are about being welcomed. Mostly the stories are about friendship. There's lots of photos of these guys, standing outside someone's house, having a cup of tea, or they've got, there's a little child and they're chatting to them, or, there's lots of friendship that's happening here. Lots of really strong connections. Some connections that went on for decades after the war.
Those soldiers who went from the now Pakistani side to fight in the Second World War, how are they being remembered in Pakistan, or are they being remembered in Pakistan?
Well, that's also a great question, and I've only been here for a short while, so I'm still beginning to find this out.
We've got the story of course, Mr. General Muhammad Akbar Khan, that has been detailed by his great-grandson, but apart from that, we don't find so many stories.
No, that's my impression, is that people, I feel like people want to remember. There's a Facebook group called Vintage Pakistan, and I put a photo on there, and people have started to respond to it. And I have the sense that people want to remember. They want to know what this part of their history was and what happened, but they don't know. And there are some historians who know, and particularly there's some military historians, and I've met some really good military historians who are in touch with that history. But even people, my question is, if you were the child or the grandchild of one of these soldiers, or indeed another soldier from here who went to the war, do you know what they did? Is that knowledge in the family?
It's not really necessary that knowledge might have been transferred from one generation to the other. It might have remained with the person who might have talked in bits and pieces to his sons or daughters. But when it goes to from one generation to the other, it's not always necessary that information is transmitted, is it?
No, that's right. And people, old people, my experience in the UK is that as people reach the end of their life, they want to tell those stories. Maybe they haven't told them till then. Maybe those stories are traumatic and difficult and hard, but they want to tell those stories towards the end of their life. And then it's good to be there. It's good to be there and to listen, and for that, as a family member. For example, my father-in-law is 95, and to hear his stories now is wonderful. He has these great stories from the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and you have to be there for your older generation, I think.
That's true, and you need to kind of assimilate that information or jot it down somewhere, because it's only this way that history goes from one generation to the other, and people get to know of who their forefathers were. And in this case, a lot of families in Pakistan might get to know who their forefathers were doing during the Second World War when they went and participated in the Second World War. You talked about one unit that was captured. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, that was the 22nd Company, and they had 3 officers, and 2 of those officers were white British, and one of them was from here. One of them was Captain Anis Ahmed Khan, and he was he was put into a prisoner of war camp, and they were all put into prisoners of war camp. So there was about 320 of them, and they were put in camp initially in France, and then later they went to a prisoner of war camp. Some of them went to a prisoner of war camp in Germany, and they were spread out. And I think it must have been quite difficult for them, you know. I mean, here they are, thousands of miles away from home, and you know, there was a lot of concern about them. Of course, there was a lot of concern about them in the India office and in the government and in the army. Where, you know, had they been captured or what? And then they found out that they had been captured, and they started to write letters backwards and forwards. And they also, one thing that happened in the war was that the Red Cross would send a parcel every week to a prisoner of war. Now, for these prisoners, for these guys from Punjab, there was a thing that was set up in London called the Indian Comforts Fund. And that fund, that organisation, was responsible for making special parcels to go to these prisoners, special parcels to go to the Asian prisoners who were being held in Europe. And that had special supplies in it, so it had spices in it, for example. And they were getting this kind of support. And then some of them, well, it's interesting, amongst those 300 and something, most of them just stayed there for the duration of the war. They stayed in the prisoner camp. Some of them joined the Germans. So about 20 of them joined the German side. And the Germans had a regiment, the 950th Regiment, which was made up entirely of South Asian soldiers that had come from prisoners of war camp. So 20 of them joined that, and some of them became quite famous in that. So a guy called Abu Zar, for example, who became an officer in that regiment. And some of them escaped. So whilst you have most of them who did nothing, some of them joined the Germans, and some of them escaped and got home. And there's some lovely stories about that. So there's, so for example, Buland Khan. Buland Khan was a man, and there's a report about that. There's a wonderful report that was...
About the escape of Buland Khan.
Yes, exactly, yeah. A report that was written by a British colonel when he got back here to South Asia, to Jalandhar. And he was captured because he was on a train. So when the Germans attacked, he was on a train that was going towards the front line to reinforce some of the guys. And the train was bombed by the Germans. And there were 4 killed, and they're buried now in a cemetery in France. 4 of them were killed, and he was quite badly injured in his left arm and on his face. And he said that if he hadn't had his helmet, because he was wearing a helmet then, he would probably have been killed. So he was taken to a hospital in the north of France and then to another hospital in Paris. And then by this time, the Germans had overrun the whole country. And he was taken prisoner, and he went down, and eventually they amputated most of his arm. They took off his arm. And he was taken down to the south of France, to Marseille, and then the American consul helped him to get away, helped him to escape across the Alps into Spain. Spain was neutral. From there he went to Gibraltar, and from Gibraltar he went... The story that he said was that in Gibraltar, the British general said to him, "Do you want to go to Britain, or do you want to go back home?" And he said, "I want to go back home, please." Oh, so he then got very slowly on a number of boats that went, so he went round to Freetown in Sierra Leone, down to South Africa. People were very generous. Someone gave him £6, he said, from slowly up the east coast of Africa, Mozambique, all the way to Aden, eventually across the Indian Ocean to Bombay, and eventually, finally, about a year later, he made it back to Jalandhar, to the Royal Indian Army Service Corps headquarters. And then the Colonel Wainwright said in his report that he was very happy to be back, and he was also very happy because this soldier wasn't a smoker. He didn't smoke cigarettes, and therefore there was a lot of money saved in his account.
All right. You talked about Buland Khan, you talked about Chaudhry Wali Muhammad also, whose son has a huge taxi business in Woking. But there's also this story about the second Lieutenant Sayyid Amiruddin Jafri. Tell us a little bit about that. Yeah,
well, that's a bit of a mystery, that story. So he was an officer who came out slightly later. He came to Britain in 41, I think. So his name was Sayyid Amiruddin Jafri. I think he's from a fairly prosperous, rich family. I think he's from he's quite well educated. I haven't seen a photo of him yet, but I think he's quite a posh guy. He's a lieutenant, a second lieutenant, then he becomes a lieutenant, and eventually he becomes a captain. And he works with the 32nd Company. And he was very successful, and he was so successful that in the end of 1943, before they came back here, there were four men were invited to Buckingham Palace, which is where the King and the Queen lived. And he was invited to Buckingham Palace, and he met the King and he met the Queen, and they shook hands, and they had cups of tea, and they had scones, and they had all, like a high tea, really, they had there together in Buckingham Palace. And I would but that's all I know.
All
so
right.
again, I would really love to meet, to know, you know.
But how do you trace the names of these soldiers? How do you trace them? Where do the exact names of these soldiers come from?
That's a very good question. Well, I have, as I say, I have about 2,000 names, which I've got from looking at archives, all sorts of different archives. And I know the names, and I know in a lot of cases, I know their service numbers. So, for example, this is a list. This is a list of the 25th Company.
All right.
So this is, that's about 250 men on that list.
All right.
You know, and that tells you their name and their number and their rank as well. So, you know, they're all sorts of, all different ranks are there. Now, in some cases, about 100 cases, I also know that where they were from. I know their village. I know their address. In that case, I can go to the village and I can say, you know, this man, let's say, Dost Muhammad, he was from your village. Does anyone know about Dost Muhammad? Is there any relatives of his still here, or did he migrate? Did he move to the city, or did he move to, I don't know, to Canada?
All right.
So I can do that. But that's only a few of them. But more than that, I'm going to do some work in the archives here in Islamabad and see if I can find any more information about them, whether they continued in the war, continued in the army after the war, and maybe there's some records about them after the war. But it's not going to be easy.
It's not going to be an easy task, I'm sure about that. How has been the reception from the Pakistani side since you've been here in the country to find out, to trace out the families of those soldiers?
The reception has been fantastic, really. I've been so pleased and overwhelmed with the generosity and the helpfulness of people. So, for example, Major General Syed Ali Hamid, who has been helping me a lot, he's been incredibly helpful and generous, and other people who I've met. And I think there's a real interest. There's a real sense that people feel this is part of their history as a country, but also part of their history of maybe their family, you know, and they want to help.
Those whose families remained in the United Kingdom, how well have they assimilated, or have they still retained some of their Asian or Pakistani roots?
They both, I think. I mean, I think, you know, so people like Mohammed Zubair in Woking, and other friends of mine, I know people who, you know, they are British Pakistanis. They're not Pakistani and they're not British, they're both. And I think that's great, because that makes for a really interesting mix. You know, I think that I live in a country now which is a multicultural society. We have people from all around the world who live in Britain, and they all bring something interesting to add to our culture. So, you know, the British Pakistanis, they bring us great food, you know, they bring us really interesting, they bring us music. They bring us literature. They bring us the Urdu language. You know, they bring us films and novels and stories, and they bring the religion of Islam. All of these things that they're adding to the cultural mix of the United Kingdom, I think, are really interesting things.
Ghee, post-Brexit, do you feel that any change has occurred as far as that assimilation of different cultures is concerned in the United Kingdom?
Well, that's a really good question, and I think it's possible to be paranoid, a little bit paranoid about.
Why be paranoid about?
Well, because I mean, there are bad things that are happening in my country, you know, and people are attacked, and Islamophobia exists, and racism exists, and there are attacks. But I also think that actually there is a very large proportion of the population who are in favour of multiculturalism, who are against Brexit, who want to see a country that is welcoming for everybody, and a country where people of all different sorts are welcomed and are made to be part of our culture. So I'm positive. I'm optimistic about the future, really.
When we talk about history, we can't leave other aspects of relationship between two countries behind, whether it be culture that you talked about vehemently, as far as those Pakistanis whose families are now settled in England and are British Pakistanis, but there's also the historical aspect that we have been talking about since the very beginning. This is what you hear trace out as well. But there's also the trade. In the Sunday Guardian last year in April, there was a very interesting article on how the United Kingdom is more and more interested as far as improving trade ties with Pakistan is concerned, post the China-Pakistan economic corridor as well, because that seems for them as well, for us it is, but for even countries like the United Kingdom, they feel that it's going to bring a real change in the whole region, and their participation will also help them financially and trade-wise as far as both countries are concerned. When you see trade between two countries, do you feel that countries such as the United Kingdom and Pakistan can benefit from each other's trade, existing trade, and improve on it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, we live in a globalized world where trade is happening, international trade is happening all the time. And when people talk about Brexit, they say, some people who are in favor of Brexit, they say this gives us an opportunity to trade with the Commonwealth, for example, or with the rest of the world. And so I think there's a lot we can benefit from. I mean, I'm not a businessman. I'm a social historian, so I'm interested in people. I'm interested in people, and I'm interested in people that cross boundaries. I'm interested in the trade, if not trade, but the kind of migration of human beings. I think for me, that's the most interesting part of globalization.
All right. I'll quote Leo Tolstoy, who says that historians are like deaf people who go on answering questions that no one has asked them. How much do you agree with that?
Oh, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think there's a question about how well historians are able to talk to people, which I think is implied within that. As historians, I think we have a duty to engage with ordinary people, to talk to people, to do, to work in the media and to tell stories, if you like, not just inside universities to each other, but to the world.
That's true. As far as a historian, Ghee, people say a historian needs to be exact, sincere, impartial, free from passion, unbiased by interest, by fear, by resentment, or by affection. How much does that apply to you?
I think that applies a lot. I mean, I think I'm driven by some passion. But when I look at documents and when I evaluate evidence and when I read something, I have to be impartial. I have to look at it and say, why was this document written? Who wrote it? What's the political context, if you like, that they're writing in? Why are they thinking to write like this? What's the bias? Because when we're talking about South Asia and the British Raj, we're talking about a history of oppression and of imperialism. And so when something is written by Lieutenant Colonel Hills, for example, who was the commanding officer of Force K6, he's writing it from a particular standpoint. Yes, he's a great supporter of the soldiers and he understands them to some extent, but he's also very much at the heart of the British Raj. And so I have to understand those things when I read it.
All right. Finally, Ghee, so many people, so many stories, so many things that you could research on. How long do you feel all of this is going to take in your point of view? Because you've got a huge list of people.
I've been working on this for about 5 years. I think I'm going to be working on it for about at least 2 or 3 more years. I will do a thesis, I will publish a book. But actually, I think I want to carry on, a bit longer. Because all of these, there's a list of all these men here, each of these was an individual. A single individual man who had his own story and his own perspective and his own individuality. Each of one of those has a story that should be found.
That is very interesting. I think it's important in the current perspective of things that people understand where they come from, where their history emanates from, and not deny history, but accept history and move forward and try to improve themselves on it, whether it be the United Kingdom, whether it be Pakistan. And I think history helps you not only to evaluate your past, but also to better manage your future. Ghee, so many different stories, Major Akbar, Captain Anis, Risaldar, Major Ashraf Khan, Driver Abdul Ghani, other stories that we haven't even talked about because we're short of time. When will we get to read all of those?
Oh, it may be, inshallah, about 2 years.
All right, as you said a bit before. And do you feel that this thesis might be available in Pakistan?
I hope so, yeah, I hope so. I would like to, and I would love to come back and talk to you again when I've finished.
All right, Ghee, we'll be looking forward to that. And the next time you're here, do let us know, because we'd like to get an update on all those Pakistani soldiers, those brave men from the Pakistani side of the subcontinent who went and participated in the Second World War and prove to others as well that we are a resilient nation and a nation that can overcome any opportunity or any opposition when it comes to any partner that is hostile towards us. It's very important for us as individuals, as Pakistanis as well, to understand that part of the history. I'll end this show with a little quote about Ghee Bowman himself. Somebody has said that Ghee is an extremely capable, experienced facilitator and trainer, has excellent organizational skills, and has enormous expertise in designing processes for all kinds of meetings and trained events, and has been a historian that people are going to look forward to in the coming years. I hope we in Pakistan will also look forward to that. Ghee Bowman, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for that passion that you've exuded during the show to tell us about the stories of those Pakistani soldiers who participated along with the British in the Second World War. It's important for not only the people in the United Kingdom, but also for the people in Pakistan to understand their past and to manage their future by having an idea of what their past is all about. They say history seldom repeats itself, but if it does, we need to be prepared for it. Ghee, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That brings us to the end of this episode of Diplomatic Enclave. We'll be back, inshallah, next week, same time, same channel. Take care of yourselves. Allah Hafiz. And Ghee, thank you very much again.
My pleasure.